So when General Basinger asked me to come and speak about cyber deterrence, my first thought was, I don't know anything about cyber deterrence, and then I had to remember that, oh no, I guess I'm trapped because I'm the acting Director General of Cyberspace for the Canadian Forces. So I better have something to say. Um, and largely speaking, I guess, just in fairness, most of what I do is I'm a force developer. So I'm not an operations guy. I don't actually launch cyber operations myself. What I do, my team, my division, what we do is we're building the capabilities and the force structures for Canadian military cyber capabilities, cyber domain capabilities going forward into the future. And so, largely speaking, and I'll get to this perhaps at the end if we have time, to talk about what we're doing as Canadians in this space. Well, mostly we have our heads down trying to deliver on the projects and other initiatives that we have in the mix. So we don't often think in the grand scheme of things about the theory of deterrence in our space and big bold strategies. We're in the process of delivering down on some things that our recent defense policy has given us to do. So thanks for the opportunity to come and scramble in the last little while to put some thoughts together here to speak about cyber deterrence or cyber and deterrence. Hopefully that meshes with the theme of my colleagues here in the panel. And so I'd like to talk first and foremost about cyber, sort of what is cyber, our thinking about cyber, so just some general concepts, if you will. I have recently become more aware of the theory of cyber deterrence, so I've got some thoughts to maybe relate on that, sort of to provoke some further discussion. And then if there is time, I will give you a little bit of a presentation on what we're doing as Canadians in that space. So first, what is cyber? And it's always very interesting. So we still are not doctrinally pure. We haven't really aren't comfortable yet fully with what these definitions mean. In fact, cyber, is it a noun or is it an adjective? That's one of the first questions you have to wrestle with. But if I can talk about cyberspace, largely speaking, what we're talking about is the broad environment of electromagnetic phenomenon, largely a man-made space when we talk about devices that exploit EM phenomenon, but also includes the physical free space environment where electromagnetic waves propagate. So my public affairs folks tell me, don't use electromagnetic. People don't know what that means, but I know this is a smart crowd, so I'm going to stick to that sort of understanding. So what we include here when we talk in a broad context about cyberspace are certainly computers and computer networks, the routers and switches and servers and the storage that are associated. But it also includes the encryption devices and software that goes along with that. Electro-optical sensors, including radars, radios, telephones, and satellites, and electronic control systems. You could probably add a few more things in there. And just so make the point, this is an Apple iPhone 6 Plus, and this is first and foremost a radio, right? First thing you think, well, your information's on there, privacy, but if you're encrypted, of course, then you can't know too much about me from a cyber perspective. But you have to remember this is tied to a base station somewhere close by in the neighborhood here. So if I know the radio waves propagating between this device and a base station, I can locate. You can all be located just from the radios that you're all carrying around in your pockets. So not to forget that it's beyond just computer networks. We often think it's just hacking on computer networks, and it's broader than that. In that regard, cyber, if you will, as a domain of warfare, is not really all that new. It's in fact older than airplanes. If you go back as long as the early 1800s when the telegraph was invented, you could say that was the first invention of a man-made cyber environment. And that's, of course, extended to the use of high-frequency radio systems pioneered by Mr. Marconi over 100 years ago. From a warfare perspective, the U.S. Army Signal Corps, one of the oldest, I think maybe even is the oldest military signal corps, exploited the use of telegraph in the Civil War. And of course, if you've been watching movies, you would know the Imitation Game, the game that Alan Turing and others played during the Second World War, in the code-breaking games that were played that we could say largely significantly contributed to the winning of the war. We can then distinguish sort of collectively within this cyber domain of warfare two subdomains, if you will. One is the global cyber commons that includes, of course, the internet and our national or international telecommunications fabric. And also then a subset, if you will, is an organization's own built cyberspace, your own computer networks, communication systems, and information repositories. So then, okay, so what are cyber operations? And we can distinguish cyber operations, sort of narrow it down then from the broad perspective into what we would then characterize as more network operations or cyber operations conducted through networks, and distinguish that from our own IT service operations or network operations that we do internally to keep our own networks working. So if there's the one flavor has cyber operations focused on adversary, the other is, of course, supporting and enabling our own use of our own built cyber environments. So this has two flavors then, a passive, if you will, component that's about protection and security activities, including system hardening and resilience against attacks. That includes your firewalls, encryption systems, backup systems, antivirus, and whatnot. And then, of course, the active, more interesting, active cyber components that have defensive response actions. So actions that you will do in responding to a cyber attack against you or other things that involve you going off your own cyber environment into the global commons or, frankly, into the adversaries' networks and systems to create effects. And, of course, then the pure offensive actions that you'll do as well, very similar, obviously, in kind. So it must be apparent to everyone that it's very hard to kill people with just cyber, right? So directly you can't kill people with cyber. Those effects are more indirect, and it's, falls into the realm of collateral damage and associated effects with the direct activities that you'll conduct in cyberspace. But we do understand that involves perhaps an indirect taking of lives, hence the military interest in this space. So what are the new realities of cyberspace, if you will, as a domain of conflict? Perhaps you could debate the fact, but my understanding is we would understand that the first cyber wars have already happened, or cyber conflicts have already happened, going back to even 2007 with the, let's say, reasonable belief that it was the Russians that were cyber attacking Estonia, its government and economy. 2008, similarly, cyber attacks against Georgia in its war, a conventional war with Russia. We know that the classic adversaries of the Western world, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and others, are known to be developing offensive cyber capabilities and using them clandestinely, or so they believe. And also, as certainly the last presentation highlighted, that even non-state actors are becoming very sophisticated in their ability to use cyber capabilities to support information warfare, if you will. Clearly, there's a dependency that we all have in modern society on our information technologies and cyberspace capabilities for economic, governmental, and certainly personal use. So some of the considerations that for conducting cyber operations would be, one, what is the relationship of cyberspace, our use of cyberspace, to our national interests, and how that relates to thresholds for how we would respond to any encroachment on those national interests. Clearly that's a matter of policy, and maybe we could have some discussion about that later. Another consideration, obviously, and it was highlighted clearly in the previous presentations, about the ability to detect and attribute adversary activities. And it's not as easy as it sounds, and some of you may well understand that trying to pin the rose on the appropriate adversary for what we perceive as cyber attacks is not clear in a lot of ways. We're getting better at it, but it's not as easy as you would think. Finally, we have to think about measured or in proportional responses to our cyber activities, and we would understand, again, it's not a direct way of harming people. Certainly it is a direct way of harming infrastructure, but there are often second and third order effects that come into play. They're often hard to calculate in advance. Some of these things become only apparent after you've tried them. So perhaps we can look at the question I would have posed to me, I suppose, is that can we use cyber as an effective mode of deterrence? And then the question might be to deter what and how. But maybe another way to look at it is can modes of deterrence be leveraged to protect cyberspace for our use? And maybe that's another way of looking at this question. So understanding, so very simply perhaps, what we have to consider when we talk about deterrence is, one, have we made it clear our intent to protect our interests as they relate to cyberspace or our use of cyberspace? Do we have the credible capabilities to deny or respond to hostile acts against those interests? And three, how do we factor the adversary's calculus in an uncertain environment that encourages or dissuades those hostile acts? So if I can jump now, maybe segue into sort of theories of cyber deterrence, and I'm going to draw on an article that I found quite useful, written by Will Goodman, called Cyber Deterrence, Tougher in Theory Than in Practice, from the Strategic Studies Quarterly of fall 2010. So one of the quotes I picked up from this article that I liked was, "Cyber deterrence, like all other deterrence, succeeds when an adversary decides not to act aggressively." So certainly, as I alluded to just a moment ago, it's a conflict. It's about a conflict of interest. So we're talking about adversaries. It is conflict that we are interested in here, and it's about provoking an adversarial relationship. So we can talk Canada, U.S. There is no conflict of interest. Let's say, generally speaking, there's no conflict of interest that provokes an adversarial relationship. So we don't need to talk about cyber deterrence when we talk about our friends and allies. So the next piece, of course, then is about cost-benefit analysis that considers the use of cyber. This is based, necessarily it's based on imperfect information, how information is received by the adversary, what their own calculus of the situation is, and whether or not there's sufficient understanding of our ability to deter and respond to their activities. Often, and I think that was touched on in previous presentations, that's often a challenging game to play. It must consider, obviously, the futility, so our own cyber resilience, and the penalty or our retaliation capability, cyber or otherwise, versus the potential gains they may seek to achieve. I'll just jump to Goodman here, another quote summarizing cyber deterrence theory. It says, states must continually communicate on matters of cyber conflict to ensure that deterrent messages are projected, received, and understood. States must maintain effective denial measures and threaten credible penalties. If attacked, victim states must be able to correctly identify the responsible state or states to counterattack, either through effective investigation or assigned responsibility. States must ensure that at least some of their counterattack capabilities cannot be disabled by an overwhelming cyber-first strike. Most importantly, the deterring state must have geopolitical symmetry, if not favorable asymmetry, with potential adversaries to deter them from cyber aggression. Last, the absence of reassuring promises can hinder states wishing to reach a stable cyber deterrence relationship. So then in the article, Goodman goes on to examine two cyber deterrence failure cases, both being Estonia and Georgia, although he does, in the article, admit to their partial success in those cases. As well, he touches on 3 cases of cyber espionage against the United States in that time frame. So what I derived from that is that the major challenges and issues as to failure come back to certainly that problem of attribution again, and the enjoyment of anonymity of attackers, largely that we understand. We're getting better at characterizing, but that is clearly one of the major challenges for cyber operations. So you want to be very cautious and judicious about responding when you're not quite sure, quite clear about who is the perpetrator. The next sort of challenge or issue that leads to failure in this space is the asymmetry of cyberspace dependency and susceptibility to harmful effects. Obviously, going head-to-head with somebody who wields much more power in this space is a dangerous game to play. Certainly, the Estonians and the Georgians learned that the hard way. Also, and associated with that is the asymmetry in national power. So even if your adversary can't necessarily respond in kind or to degree, there's other ways, using other instruments of national power, of course, to respond. Another problem with smaller states dealing with a state like Russia. And of course, there's the unpredictability, sorry, as I mentioned, of the cyber ops and weapons effects that come from your use of cyber. You're never quite sure how far that will go. And one of those examples that we could draw on is the Stuxnet virus that was allegedly used by our friends and allies to take down the Iranian nuclear enrichment program, that obviously had follow-on effects for some others, perhaps some folks in this room. I'll just jump back to another point that Goodman makes about relevant to cyber espionage. Although states should include cyber espionage in their cyber deterrence strategies, cyber espionage deserves distinction from other types of cyber attack. Cyber espionage involving only intelligence collection harms confidentiality, but not integrity or availability. And as scholar and Professor Martin Libicki notes, the law of war rarely recognizes information collection as a casus belli, and a good case for changing this has yet to be made. So states probably could not justifiably retaliate against other states for cyber attacks involving only the collection of confidential information. And finally, he concludes by making a few poignant remarks that I'd like to highlight again here. Attribution may be difficult, but it is not impossible. Strategic cyber attacks may not have materialized yet, but cyber deterrence strategies must account for the scalability of surreptitious cyber attacks. While futility, interdependence, and counterproductivity have promise, they have not yet yielded the desired results. Reassurance is an important and as yet unaccounted for component of a reliable cyber deterrence strategy. Escalation dominance remains a key component of effective deterrence, including cyber deterrence. It must be painstakingly clear what activities will not be tolerated in cyberspace and the consequences of those activities. So my own thoughts, and perhaps reflecting the comments of my colleague here, is that cyber is just one of the instruments, maybe a new instrument of national power. I'm a NATO Staff College trained guy, enough to know that we can easily think of and use in our discussions the DIME paradigm of diplomacy, information, military, and economics when we talk about national power. And I would propose, along with L perhaps, that we could add a C to that. That is now cyber capabilities, not just as military capabilities. Clearly, mature nations are developing non-military cyber capabilities to deal with adversaries going forward into the future. Those cyber capabilities, protective, active, if you will, and deterrent, complement and indeed support and enable the use of the other DIME capabilities, as well as being available independently for use. So, when we could talk perhaps in the questions about how this relates to hybrid warfare, but certainly as part of the instruments of national power portfolio available to all states, then cyber contributes overall to deterrence against hostile adversaries interfering with our national interests, whether in cyberspace itself or in any other domain of activity. So my perspective is that these things are complementary and should be used as a portfolio of response options, one with the other, or independently as desired by the particular sovereign nation or in coalitions. Now, if I have a little bit of time left, I could perhaps just up to date you on what we're doing in Canada in our efforts to build up our own cyber capabilities, cyber deterrence capabilities, if you will. So for those that maybe are unaware, it's not the Department of National Defence or the military in Canada that leads our cyber defence responses, if you will, or has those responsibilities. That falls domestically to our public safety department, that is the lead and coordinator for cybersecurity across the government of Canada, and working with our various industry sectors to ensure that they're taking measures for cybersecurity. We also have the Communications Security Establishment, which is our lead coordinating agents for foreign signals intelligence collection, communications and information protection, and active cyber operations, non-military active cyber operations capabilities. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police has the mandate federally for cyber crime investigation and law enforcement. The Shared Services Canada Department is the provider of government IT, and that includes its own IT security mechanisms. So the Department of National Defence, Canadian Forces, largely our responsibilities fall to the protection and securing of our own IT infrastructure and networks. And we are in the midst of enhancing and developing improved active cyber operations capability as a relatively new mandate given to us by the government. And of course, we are able in Canada to use those capabilities in the aid to civil authorities when so called upon and authorized by the government. So 3 relatively new developments for us. One was government direction for the Canadian Forces to work closely with our Communications Security Establishment to develop active cyber capabilities, operational capabilities as a one mission, so a conjoined team of public servants in that department with military folks working side by side to enable us to employ the law of armed conflict and rules of engagement in our use of cyber for military purposes, alongside the very intelligent folks in Communications Security Establishment who have the significant technical means to bring to bear. As well, the recent budget to 2018 this year, you'll have noted perhaps the pledge of $507 million for the development of a Center for Cybersecurity within those other government agencies that we in the Department of National Defence are working closely with. And others may note that there is ongoing efforts to push a Bill C-59, the National Security Act, through Parliament. I believe it's still at second reading, that largely will modernize the Communications Security Establishment and its abilities to assist with active cyber operations. Within the Department and the Canadian Forces, we've received direction in the past year from our Chief of Defence Staff to get on with creating a cyber force under a cyber force commander. So that work's ongoing to formalize and structure that organization. We're working significantly, again, as I mentioned earlier, with our heads down to respond to our strong, secure, engaged defense policy that came out a year ago, and the 8 key joint cyber initiatives that largely is a portfolio of dozens of projects, roughly valued around $2 billion that we have to chew through in the next 10 years. We've stood up a new cyber operator occupation, and a primary reserve component for that is in development. We've got an agreed framework, as I've mentioned before, a one mission framework with CSE on our ACO capabilities. We're establishing a national strategic cyber mission assurance program, and we're working with Five Eyes partners, learning massively from our US counterparts and our UK counterparts to bring something to maturity here for Canada. And we're involved in a number of course, interdepartmental and international communities, first and foremost with our U.S. partners, our Five Eyes partners, and NATO to develop these capabilities.